The following is a presentation of New Worker Radio. The views and opinions expressed therein do not necessarily represent those of WZML, its staff, or management.
Hello, and welcome to New Worker News on WZML 92.9. My name is Manolis, bringing you national and international updates from a worker's perspective.
We'd like to begin today's episode with devoting a significant section of this episode to dispelling the U.S. imperialist propaganda surrounding its justification for its criminal bombing of Iran. On March 25th, 2025, during the presentation of the annual threat assessment of the U.S. intelligence community, Director Tulsi Gabbard stated that the intelligence agencies continue to assess that Iran is not currently pursuing nuclear weapons and that Supreme Leader Khamenei has not reinstated the nuclear weapons program he halted in 2003. The intelligence community remains vigilant in monitoring any potential shift in Tehran's position regarding the resumption of such a program. This assessment did not align with the immediate strategic objectives of the U.S. government in the Middle East. As a result, on Friday, June 20th, the President publicly stated that Director Gabbard had made a mistake and claimed that Iran could potentially develop a nuclear weapon within a few months. Shortly afterward, the intelligence community's assessment was brought in line with the political and military agenda of the administration and its ally, Israel. The history of nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction as a pretext for imperialists to launch interventions and wars is very old. The invasion and occupation of Iraq by the U.S. and its allies proceeded under this very pretext. So, did the U.S.-NATO intervention in Syria, which took place under the pretext of neutralizing the Assad's government's chemical weapons, while similar things had been said about the intervention in Libya. Now it's Iran's turn, although it is not the first time that its nuclear program has been targeted in this way. The situation echoes the alarming lead-up to the U.S.-NATO invasion of Iraq, not only in tone, but in substance. A key figure linking the two is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has been claiming since 1992, during his time as a member of parliament, that Iran was just steps away from developing nuclear weapons. It is the same Netanyahu who, in the years that followed, repeatedly played the role of a provocateur in pushing for military action against Iraq, citing alleged stockpiles of chemical and nuclear weapons that never materialized. In 2002, during testimony before the U.S. Congress, Netanyahu confidently asserted that Saddam Hussein was actively pursuing nuclear weapons and warned that once he succeeded, terrorist networks would gain access to them as well. When asked whether other countries besides Iraq warranted preemptive strikes, he named Iran and Libya, claiming Iran was even ahead of Iraq in developing ballistic missile systems capable of reaching the U.S. East Coast within 15 years, excluding California, he added, but including Washington. He painted a dire picture, insisting that Libya was also secretly racing to develop atomic weapons. These alarmist claims, made without evidence and later disproven, played directly into the drumbeat for war, just as similar rhetoric today is resurfacing. This was Netanyahu's depiction of the so-called network of terrorism, and when one examines the current map of the Middle East and North Africa, with its devastated states, collapsed governments, and ongoing conflicts, it speaks volumes about the consequences of such narratives. On March 20th, 2003, the United States and its allies launched an invasion of Iraq, claiming that Saddam Hussein's government, once an ally of the U.S. in the region, was developing weapons of mass destruction and aiding al-Qaeda. The Bush administration had already secured congressional approval for the authorization for use of military force against Iraq back in October 2002. A month before the invasion, in February 2003, Secretary of State Colin Powell stood before the United Nations and presented what was described as so-called evidence that Iraq was concealing weapons of mass destruction intended for use by al-Qaeda, evidence that was later discredited. Just 2 years later, the American hawk Colin Powell appeared, brazenly and with provocative hypocrisy, to express regret for his infamous UN presentation that helped trigger the U.S. invasion of Iraq. That intervention opened a cycle of bloodshed, claiming over 1 million Iraqi lives and setting off domino effects throughout the Middle East. His performance stands as a monument to shamelessness and mockery. He ultimately confessed that Iraq had no program to produce chemical weapons of mass destruction. This truth was known well before the first bombs fell. The U.S. and its allied governments were not misled. They were fully aware from the outset that their justifications for war were manufactured. According to former Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill, the Bush administration had already decided to invade Iraq as early as January 2001. As he bluntly recounted, the issue was never whether to invade, but how to justify it. The president was saying, according to O'Neill, "Find me a way to do it." On the day of the attack on the Twin Towers, September 11, 2001, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was asking his staff to prepare a plan for an attack on Iraq, despite the fact that there was no evidence linking that country and its government to al-Qaeda, as all U.S. intelligence agencies later admitted. The president's morning briefing of September 21, 2001, a highly classified document, itself stated explicitly that there was no connection between Iraq and the September 11th attacks, nor any collaboration with al-Qaeda. A report from the Intelligence Directorate of the U.S. Armed Forces General Staff, dated September 5, 2002, and declassified in 2016, revealed that even before the war, U.S. knowledge of Iraq's alleged weapons of mass destruction was vague and speculative at best. The report admitted that understanding of Iraq's nuclear weapons program was based largely on the analysis of unclear information, and ultimately concluded, "Our assessments are based largely on analytical assumptions and judgments rather than hard evidence." In February 2003, the International Atomic Energy Agency concluded its investigation, finding no evidence or credible indication that Iraq had resumed a nuclear weapons program. Meanwhile, Powell was presenting his so-called evidence at the UN. It later emerged that much of this evidence relied heavily on the testimony of an Iraqi defector living in Germany, codenamed Curveball. Both Germany's Federal Intelligence Service and British MI6 had warned the U.S. State Department that Curveball's claims were unreliable, a fact he himself eventually admitted. Another key source cited by the U.S. government to justify the invasion of Iraq was Kindir Hamza, an Iraqi defector who claimed to have led Iraq's nuclear program. He defected in 1994, wrote a book in 2000, and testified before the Senate in 2002, warning Iraq could develop nuclear weapons by 2005. However, Scott Ritter, a former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer and weapons inspector, sharply criticized Hamza's credibility, pointing out that official Iraqi nuclear program records made no mention of him and named Jafar Dia Jafar as the true head. Ritter condemned the Bush administration and media for treating Hamza, a known liar and fraud by intelligence agencies, as an expert witness despite clear evidence to the contrary. Today, the imperialists are sharpening their knives again, this time against Iran under the pretext of its nuclear program. The machines of imperialist war and propaganda are working overtime. The same well-known pretexts are being chewed over in our country by all the parrots of Euro-Atlantic imperialism. No tolerance for the lies of the imperialists and their staffs. No illusions about their interventions in war. Here and now, the people must answer. Be the ones who will have the last word from the only correct side of history. In the context of the U.S.-Israeli imperialist aggression against Iran, a recent YouGov poll shows that the people of the U.S. clearly oppose military intervention in the conflict between Israel and Iran. Only 16% support intervention, while a full 60% say no. Another 24% are unsure. At the same time, a majority, that is 56%, support continuing negotiations on Iran's nuclear program. Despite the Trump administration's escalation of its military presence in the region, and despite rising tensions, the public is showing a preference for diplomacy over new wars. This comes at a time when the U.S. has around 40,000 troops in the Middle East, mostly tied to air and naval bases. Analysts say a direct ground war is unlikely, but increased air and naval strikes by U.S. forces are likely already in the planning stages. The people of the U.S. do not want another imperialist war, but the bourgeois state cares little about the will of the people. Capital demands constant military dominance, and the U.S. bases around the Persian Gulf are not there for the sake of peace. The U.S. backing of Israel is not a mistake or a diplomatic maneuver. It is a conscious part of the imperialist order. For us, it is crucial to expose this. Even when the people shout, "No," the war machine continues to grind, because as long as capital rules, so does war. In other national and international news, the G7 summit in the Canadian Rockies was supposed to send a signal of unity and the ability to act. But what remained in the end was one thing above all: disillusionment. Before the summit began, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz boastfully declared that the 7 leading industrialized nations would present themselves as one, but the actual impression left by the summit was a different one. That is, disagreement, stalling, and sharp differences characterized the meeting. On the very first day, the noble intentions disintegrated into disputes over trade, war, and geopolitical conflicts. U.S. President Donald Trump made it clear that he viewed the G7 more as a stage than a platform for joint strategies. His premature departure left no doubt that unity was at best a pipe dream. A few meager sentences on the Middle East conflict affirming Israel's so-called right to defense and branding Iran a primary source of instability were the only common outcome, and even the statement was reduced to a minimum by Trump's deletions. What was deleted, however, is unknown. A final document, as is usually the case at such summits, was not even prepared this time, a clear signal of growing contradictions. Instead, attempts were made to maintain at least the appearance of unity through isolated, more or less devoid of content declarations. Even these, however, remain without Trump's signature. A particularly piquant example, a declaration on dealing with China's dominance in the area of critical raw materials, was not signed by Trump, despite its clear targeting of Beijing. Trade, normally the dominant issue, devolved into a farce. Despite threatened and existing U.S. tariffs on cars, steel, and aluminum, the G7 failed to agree on a common strategy. Although Merz spoke of small steps towards a solution, hopes for an early agreement are dimmed. While the war in Ukraine provided some moments of solidarity, it also revealed the fragility of this alliance. The G7 promised further military aid and sanctions against Russia, but U.S. President Trump expressed doubts about Russia's exclusion from the G8 and showed little interest in an early ceasefire. After Trump's departure, at least a few declarations were signed, a success that resembles minimum standards rather than real progress. At the same time, the escalating Middle East conflict is creating additional dynamism that the G7 has been unable to diffuse. Even Japan, in its sharp criticism of Israel's attacks, clearly deviated from the Western line, which only underscores the group's fragmentation. The bottom line is that the picture is one of power struggles and disintegration. The G7 summit in Canada impressively demonstrated that the 7 largest industrialized nations are capable of taking action, but primarily in their disunity. This is not least a reflection of the deepening crisis of capitalism and the resulting intensification of intra-imperialist contradictions. In more national news, U.S. President Donald Trump has announced plans to privatize parts of the federal land that currently makes up about 28% of the country's surface. According to Trump's budget proposal, this land, which largely consists of protected nature, will be sold to private investors for the construction of housing. This mainly applies to states with a housing shortage and high real estate prices, that is, California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, and Utah. The proposal has sparked criticism, not least because Trump's son, 19-year-old Barron Trump, recently founded the real estate company BT Ventures LLC, which plans to build luxury homes and golf clubs in Utah, Idaho, and Arizona, 3 states that are included in the privatization plan. Similarly, accusations were made in January against Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who is suspected of profiting from real estate deals in Gaza. The The Trump administration argues that privatization is necessary to solve the housing crisis and promote economic growth. But critics warn that it is more about paving the way for widespread exploitation for the benefit of a small clique of investors, including the president's own family. We stress here that private ownership of land is one of the most fundamental forms of capitalist exploitation. Trump's initiative is a classic expression of how the late capitalist state functions, not as a neutral steward of society's interests, as many idealists dream of a benevolent capitalist state, but as a tool for the direct profit interests of the ruling class. By selling off public land, natural resources, and ecological values to private sectors, U.S. imperialism shows its true face: corruption, nepotism, and predatory exploitation in the name of capital. This affair is not an exception, but a logical consequence of a social order in which property and power are concentrated in the hands of a few. The private ownership of land, especially in countries built through colonial conquest, is one of the most fundamental forms of capitalist exploitation. The fact that the president's own family is first in line for billions of dollars in profits only underlines the need to smash the bourgeois state and build a new one, where the land is returned to the people and collectively cultivated according to plans and needs. The Communist Workers' Platform expresses its positions through its main organ, New Worker, and would like to take this time to express its solidarity with the workers and peoples of Greece who mobilized as a symbol and model for the workers and communists of our country, massive protests and demonstrations against the U.S. bombing of Iran in a step towards escalating the imperialist war. On June 23, 2025, Greece saw widespread strikes and mass demonstrations led and organized by PAME, the All-Workers Militant Front, along with various workers' unions and social organizations. Central to these protests was a large rally in Syntagma Square, Athens, with parallel actions in Thessaloniki and other cities. The Communist Party of Greece, the KKE, played a key role in mobilizing workers and the public against Greece's military involvement and its role as a NATO base, which the party condemns as contributing to the imperialist wars and regional instability. KKE leaders, including General Secretary Dimitris Koutsoumbas, actively participated and addressed the crowds, emphasizing the need to sever Greece's ties with NATO and the U.S. military and to reject imperialist interventions. Key slogans from the protest included the following: no participation, no involvement, NATO and the Americans out, no to Greece's involvement in war, stop turning the port into a NATO base, bring the frigate back from the Red Sea, bases under fire, the people in danger, NATO out, everywhere, uprising. Your bombs kill civilians and children. We will never be your allies in this. Drums of war beat in our neighborhoods. We must rise for ourselves and our children. The KKE called for a strong, united workers' movement to oppose the government's war policies, urging people to fight for the immediate disengagement of the country from the war plans of the U.S., NATO, EU, Israel plans, the cessation of all cooperation with the murderous state of Israel, the closure of the U.S. NATO bases in the country, and the return of the Greek frigate from the Red Sea, with the elimination of the artillery agreement with Saudi Arabia.
You've been listening to New Worker News on 92.9 FM WZML, your home for local, national, and international news, all from a working class perspective. New Worker News is the official organ of the Communist Workers' Platform. If you're a worker, we would like to hear from you. You can reach us at cwpusa@protonmail.com. Again, that's cwpusa@protonmail.com. If you would like more news from a worker's point of view, visit us at newworker.us. You can find weekly articles on events happening all over the country and internationally. If you've enjoyed the program and wish to see more working class reporting, consider donating to our Patreon at patreon.com/New Worker. And thank you for listening to New Worker News on 92.9 FM WZML.